In part 1 of the Sanctus Medicus series, we have discussed the deep root Sanctus Medicus as a whole has in Xianzhou's history. From being a benign sect overhauling the medical system to making contacts with Shuhu to inviting him back to Xianzhou and enabling various Shuhu attacks on Xianzhou, Sanctus Medicus, both the old and new branches, have a lot to answer to. And yet, the sheer impact of their actions has not been fully uncovered yet, for the greatest act of sabotage they had committed, the sedition of Jingliu, is still being blamed on Dan Feng in-game. In Jingliu Companion Quest, Jingliu accused Dan Feng and Yingxing as not being able to accept that Baiheng was gone. Instead of leaving her to eternal rest, you decided to. You made a mistake that can never be undone. Imbibitor Luni, the chief culprit, chose to use the Transmutation Arcanum as a means of resurrection, begetting terrible transformation and great calamity in the process. He dishonored the name of the fallen. Yingxing, the accomplice, arrogant and oblivious, used the flesh of the Abundance Emanator to assist Imbibitor Luni in his evil. He fell, becoming an immortal abomination. This specific line fueled the popular fandom theory that Bailu is Baiheng resurrected by Dan Feng and Yingxing. However, is this accusation true, or is Jingliu deceived by a third party and her own grief for Baiheng? Spoiler alert, it's not true, and Jingliu along with everyone was deceived by the Preceptors and Sanctus Medicus. Yes, it's the Shuhu organization, again, same one that snuck the Stellaron into Luofu and then blamed Jing Yuan for it. You can see that they have a bit of a track record with the blame game. For one, Bailu was actually Bloomborn Scion created by Sanctus Medicus and Co 30 years ago, not 700 years ago. More specifically, in the undestroyed letter written by Dan Shu specified that Bloomborn Scion was created as a joint project between Sanctus Medicus and some of the Preceptors. The only successful result, in fact, from hundreds of years of research ever since that unknown preceptor laughed maniacally while ordering someone else to sneak out a branch of the arbor, supposedly to create an alternative Ichor line. So unless there is a second successful Ichor line experiment in the shape of a willful little girl not chosen by proper succession and being jailed in the Alchemy Commission, the Bloomborn Scion, the artificial Ichor line of the Luofu High Elder, Bailu is almost definitely Bloomborn Scion. Regardless of whether she is Baiheng clone or not, Bailu was created by the Preceptors and the Sanctus Medicus from an arbor branch, not Dan Feng and Yingxing 700 years ago, and completely unrelated to the semi-draconic abomination frozen by Jingliu back during the sedition. Also, Dan Feng specified that he used the blood of his own race and the soul of his ancestor, neither component of which contains any mention of any Foxian. Hence, the blue blood he used in his story 3 should be the blood of his own race, and the soul of his ancestor should be that of Long, considering all of the Vidyadharas have exactly one ancestor, who is Long, not Baiheng. Note that in the Dan Heng in Beheater Lini quest, there was a line by Yuanhua that implied that reproducing a second Ichor line was Dan Feng's plan. This is actually a minor mistranslation. The actual Xian said that Yuanhua thought she understood Dan Feng's efforts, not that Bailu or the second Ichor line was his plan, and that Bailu was the key to the research. You know, the research of Yuanhua described in the Sanctus Medicus Devil's criminal evidence records, the one that involved injecting Viadhara bone marrows and fluids into different species to turn them into dragons. What a funny coincidence, wouldn't you say? Anyway, for more details on the Bloomborn Scion project, please see either my Lingsha video or Lality's Bloomborn Scion video. Lality and I work on slightly different timelines and event chronology for this edition, but we both agree on this one. In any case, the second problem with Jingliu's narrative is that it's actually a theory made by Jingliu after the fact. In her own story, it is shown that she actually arrived late, long after the semi-draconic abomination was created, and even after Yingxing the nerdy craftsman had become immortal enough to heavily wound the reigning sword champion of Luofu. It was also evident from the conversation she had with Dan Feng that she was not in the planning stage for the ritual that Dan Feng tried to do to resurrect the semi-draconic abomination with specifically the blood of his own race and the soul of his ancestor. Effectively, the The reality is that she found out about Yingxing's Shihu gift while torturing him after the facts and leapfrogged to the conclusion that he ingested Shihu's gift willingly too. Disturbed by Heng's rest, somehow, even though it's Yingxing who contained the Shihu gift and not Baiheng or Bailu, for that matter. Last I checked, Bailu is neither Mara-struck nor perfectly immortal. People won't die when they are killed, like Blade. And if you read her story closely, you can easily see why she made that leapfrog of logic, because the Preceptors preempted her and all of the Cloud Knights against Dan Feng and Yingxing before everything happened. In real life, there is a tactic called poisoning the well frequently used by the media. Poisoning the well is a type of informal fallacy where adverse information about a target is preemptively presented to an audience with the intention of discrediting or ridiculing something that the target person is about to say. For example, poisoning the well is when you write the headline as X does something good, with good in quotation marks, and add, but at what cost in the end. A headline with unbiased language would have written it as X does something good or okay, but there are uncertainties about this and that. But that's not clickbait, nor does it preempt the audience to develop negative opinion of the topic beforehand enough for most media, so that's that. And in the case of the Cloud Knights and the Preceptors, poisoning the well was exactly what happened to Jingliu and all of the Cloud Knights during the Sedition, as it was the Preceptors who joined force with the Cloud Knights to attack Dan Feng. This is also why Shihu was never directly mentioned in any official announcement of the Xianzhou authority about the sedition. In effect, this tactic of poisoning the well to frame Dan Feng is very similar to what the Preceptors are doing to Jing Yuan in the 2.4 Trailblazer plot, where, despite being very obviously the culprits of the Stellaron incidents from the audience's point of view, the Preceptors and the Sanctus Medicus, both old and new, decided to accuse Jing Yuan of their crimes. Frankly put, that seems to be a bit of their modus operandi. And it was exactly this modus operandi that they followed in the Sedition event to frame Dan Feng. More specifically, in an interactable mirage in the 1.2 Trailblazer quest, we saw the memory of a soldier who warned Dan Feng that it was a setup and that Dan Feng should not go, so the Sedition was most definitely a setup to frame Dan Feng. In addition, in Jingliu's Story 4, when asked by Jingliu, Dan Feng directly called out the Preceptors. Impossible. The Preceptors said, "The blood of my race and the soul of my ancestor should have created another High Elder. All this. It shouldn't be like this." So the Preceptors told him to do the whatever ritual in the Sedition with the blood of his race, the Dyadhara, and soul of his ancestor, which can only be long. The Preceptor's plot was detected by some soldiers who warned Dan Feng, but he did not listen and paid the price for it. But at the same time, the Preceptors and the Cloud Knights joined force to subdue Dan Feng in the description of the Ichor animation, suggesting that it was the Preceptors who, before everything happened, told Jingliu and the Cloud Knights a likely distorted version of Dan Feng's actions in the setup that they made for him, all to poison the well against Dan Feng. Exactly like what they've been doing in the current Stellaron plot against Jing Yuan and Fei Xiao. Of course, to make things more obvious, after the Sedition had happened and Dan Feng had been prosecuted, a Preceptor was shown cackling madly in the memory of an egg. He was very happy at Dan Feng's downfall as he snuck an arbor branch to the Alchemy Commission, the organization that was later responsible for Bailu's creation of the Bloom-born Scion.
Welcome, Miss Lingsha. I am Preceptor Tauron. Indeed, I helped plot the prison break in the shackling prison.
No character who cackles madly had ever been not a villain, LMAO. The Preceptors and the Sanctus Medicus are just clear and blatant villains at this point, but I'll be saving the Stellaron plot and the prison break plot for part 3 of this series. And of course, the elephant in the room is that firstly, Jingliu arrived late after the draconic abomination had already been created, and she definitely wasn't in the planning stage of the ritual itself. This means that what she told the audience about the Sedition was a theory of her based on her own experience, which can be deceived, seeing as Shihu's entire modus operandi was showing people illusions of their loved ones dying and begging the affected to save them. Secondly, she was actually Mara-struck at the time of the Sedition. This is made abundantly clear in her story, where it was stated outright that what she saw while fighting the draconic abomination was like a dream-like illusion, and, like her childhood nightmare, she felt her core SE boiling, like a ripe wheat grain about to burst out of its husk and swell to infinity. She saw herself trapped in childhood nightmares again. The ominous planet is swallowing her overhead, and she, but an insect, cannot even struggle. The woman tore off a spread of black silk from the edge of her skirt and covered her eyes. The thunder struck. She leapt up with her sword towards the draconic abomination. In a dreamlike illusion, she felt her flesh surpass its limits, beginning to disintegrate. It was as if innumerable silken threads bound her, taut across every limb and bone, each one slicing through the last vestiges of her consciousness, bit by bit. This wording can be directly compared to Xue's experience with Shuhu and Jingliu's own experience on Sangqing against also Shuhu, both of which involved tendrils bursting out of their bodies, their core SE feeling like being boiled, and being shown illusions that were not true. In Jingliu's story 1, it was a mountain flying at her face. In Xue's story 2, it was Hanya being dead, despite Hanya being alive from Hanya's point of view of the same event, because Shuhu's entire job was to tempt people with fake illusions and of their friends and loved ones so that they would give their bodies to him. Similarly, in Jingliu's story 4, she specifically cited her childhood nightmare, described the same effect Shuhu had on her when she was young, and then stated that everything was in a dreamlike illusion. Make note that in the same story, Jingliu actually did not think about Baiheng until after the "in a dreamlike illusion" description. It was only until after she got Mara-struck and heard the dreamlike illusion of presumably the Shuhu in the draconic abomination that she suddenly thought of her own bragging to Baiheng in the past. Suddenly, she heard those words. "I will cut down even the stars in the sky." Effectively, what was happening to Jingliu here was exactly what happened to Xue and Hanya in the Sangqing destruction event. She was shown illusion of loved ones and thought that they were already absorbed by the Shuhu draconic abomination. Presumably, the preceptors priming her that Dan Feng was up to no good. Before everything helped push Jingliu into thinking that Baiheng's remains were fed to the Shuhu draconic abominations to resurrect her, but it failed and Baiheng became part of the draconic abomination, which was actually just an illusion Shuhu showed to her and not really the truth. Actually, this might also explain why she got the Baiheng flashback during the fight with Blade in her companion quest. Blade is confirmed to have Shuhu in him, which probably triggered her Mara-struck and made her remember about Baiheng again. It's actually pretty funny that Jingliu's story 4 is actually a direct parallel with her companion quest, as both stories began with RenHeng choosing to face a setup head-on, Blade facing off against Jingliu. Jingliu being triggered by Shuhu mid-fight to have Baiheng flashback, and Jingyuan standing aside and doing nothing. But I digress. In any case, Jingliu actually admitted that she didn't remember Baiheng that well.
We talked about the stars we flew past, the views we saw together, and the dangers we escaped. But I can't remember the details. The things we said and did together have all been shrouded in a layer of mist. A mist I cannot see through.
And she also not so subtly dodged Jianqing's question about Baiheng's actual fate in her companion quest. So yeah, I'm pretty sure Jingliu doesn't really know what happened either. The accusations she threw at Dan Feng and Yingxing are her conjectures, made after the fact, and she only arrived at these conjectures after getting Mara-struck and manipulated by the preceptors. One thing I would like to address is Blade's voice line in Jingliu's challenge quest when he said, Why is it that only the abominations can return time and time again? Why does someone like her have to be buried, burned to ash, and eventually forgotten? Why? I have seen a lot of people taking it at face value to be confirmation that Yingxing did indeed intend to resurrect Baiheng with Shuhu's flesh like Jingliu accused him, and this is his confession to the crime. However, I would like to note that this reading is directly contradicted by Kafka's Companion Quest and Blade Story 1. In Kafka Companion Quest, in one of the dialogue options, Kafka directly told us that Blade actually did not remember anything when he woke up. He was a complete blank state with no memory whatsoever before a woman found him, taught him swordplay, and killed him repeatedly. In Blade Story 1, we learn that Jingliu was not killing him repeatedly for nothing. She was trying to make him memorize something. The English translation isn't very clear on this front, but in Chinese, she specifically asked him to memorize something and to bring death to them, not to remember something again. This is perfectly demonstrated by Jingliu's and Blade's signature voice lines. The statement of 5, 3 must pay the price, originated from Jingliu and was carved into every wound of Blade, literally. Similarly, Nowhere to Run is also one of Jingliu's battle lines, and what Blade told Dan Heng in their chase across the cosmo. In the exact same vein, Jingliu's voice was overlaid over Blade's in the Jingliu Companion Quest.
你手执硬性为你打造的剑气，一遍一遍挑刺、切割、洞穿，一遍又一遍。那些曾经降临在敌人身上的剑招，如今刻在这副可憎的躯壳上，而我只能看着自己的血肉不断抽动、愈合、复原，就像在问：为何要和隐约一起造下这场恶孽？我知道你不期待我的回答，所以当你直视我的眼睛时，我开口提问了。那是我问过自己千百遍，却没有答案的问题。
Guiding the complete blank state of Yingxing on what to say, how he should feel about himself as an abomination that returns time and time again, and how he should feel about Baiheng and the hideous crime that he supposedly did against her.
为什么只有孽物能一遍遍卷土重来？为什么他这样的人却要被埋葬，被烧成灰烬，被人遗忘？为什么？
As such, that confession of Blade in the Jingliu Challenge quest isn't a confession so much as it was a forced memory and mental state imposed upon him by Jingliu's repeated torture, as was made abundantly clear by the Jingliu voice line overlay in that sequence. I have seen a few people called it a retcon of past lore, but in opinion, it is a very classic case of red herring, even if not exactly very well executed. Written on purpose to deceive the average casual player and make them believe that Dan Feng and Yingxing were the culprits. Frankly put, the same can be said about Turon's story as well. I'm reasonably certain that I and Lality were literally the only people who took notice of the Preceptors and Turon's nefarious plots against Dan Feng and the entirety of Xianzhou for an entire year before the 2.5 trailer was released. But enough of me complaining about the execution of the Xianzhou plot. In any case, I am of the opinion that the story of the High Cloud Quintet should not be reduced to a relationship between Baiheng and Yingxing, or Baiheng and Dan Feng, or even just among the High Cloud Quintet. Looking at the entire history of Xianzhou and the actions of the Sanctus Medicus throughout history, we can see that the theme of Xianzhou is about wars and the cycle of trauma that is perpetuated by wars. In the start, it was Xianzhou wishing for immortality from Yaoshi, who gave them said immortality, which turned them against said immortality and pushed them against the Abundance forces, which led to the First Abundance War where Yue Yan lost his faith and sought out Shu Hu, who attacked Sangqing and Thalassa, traumatizing Shui, Hanya, and the High Cloud Quintet, who won defeated Shu Hu on Thalassa, which prompted Shu Hu to attack Luofu directly, which led to Baiheng's death, Yingxing's death, and the Sedition, which traumatized Jingliu again and led to the execution of Dan Feng, which directly led to the rise of the preceptor rule of the Vidyadhara and the growth of the Sanctus Medicus on Xianzhou, culminating in the Third Abundance War and the rise of Dan Shu's faction, which led to the Stellaron plot and the current Borisin prison break plot. Meanwhile, Jingliu passed on her trauma to the blank state blade, who then started to chase RenHeng across space and passed on that trauma to RenHeng. Looking at the big picture, it's pretty clear that the entire theme of Xianzhou is meant to be about the wars and the cycle of trauma perpetuated by the Eternal War. Most of all, it is about the tragedy of Xianzhou, about the Ten Lords, the ideology of eternal war under the name of Lan, and about the true meaning of permanence, which I actually intend to make a video about later. Promise. It's on my to-do list. So, looking closely at the details in the lore books, the Trailblazer quests, and Jingliu's companion quest itself, I can say for certain that this is a classic case of red herring. A false narrative pushed by the true mastermind behind the sedition to Jingliu and the Xianzhou authorities to obscure the truth that the sedition was entirely staged by Shuhu, the old Sanctus Medicus, and the Luofu preceptors to dethrone Danfeng. According to Jingliu and her companion quest, the Luofu was suddenly sieged by Shuhu and the Abundance Force one day. Sieged by Shuhu's force, Teng Xiao made an unknown deal with Ignis, a powerful Heliobi, for some schemes that we never really know the details of. Presumably, as a result of this deal, Teng Xiao allowed his body to be possessed by Ignis. It was at this time that we started to see the true extent of the Sanctus Medicus network inside the Xianzhou alliance. Amidst the siege of Luofu, Danfeng was lured into the root section of the arbor, the mountain location where the sedition would eventually take place. He had been warned by his soldiers that it was a trap by someone else, but he refused to listen and took Yingxing and a fleet of ships with him into the mountain area where Shuhu had been battling with Teng Xiao. Danfeng created Big Legless Dragon, which subsequently attempted to uproot the tree, according to Yue Yuan's testimony and the list of charges levied against him in the Ichor animation. In the year 7379 of the star calendar, the imbibitor Luni Danfeng caused turmoil that threatened the sacred wood. The Cloud Knights joined forces with the Vidyadhara preceptors to assault him. However, the attempt failed, and the dragon was lit on fire as shown in the myriad. During the event, Yingxing tried to protect Danfeng, but he was heavily wounded in the process. With the advice of the preceptors who were also at the scene, Danfeng conducted an unknown ritual with the blood of his own race and the soul of his ancestor, presumably to create a new body for Long to fight in place of the dead dragon lit on fire in the myriad, seeing as all of the Vidyadharas have only one ancestor, who is Long. He used parts of the transmutation arcanum, which in Chinese literally is just the magical method to turn into a dragon. As a result of this ritual, a second dragon body was created. However, this is a misguided attempt, because the preceptors lied to him about the true nature of the ritual, and Shuhu's true target had been Danfeng all along. The White Moon Danfeng summon turned red as the dragon Danfeng was possessed by God of Life's envoy, who was presumably just Shuhu. During the possession, Shuhu showed Danfeng many different hallucinations, including dead Baiheng, dead comrades, and a dying Yingxing, like how Shuhu showed Shui the hallucination of Hanya being dead when in fact, Hanya was alive back during the Songqing event. At the same time, the preceptors informed Jingliu and the Cloud Knights of Danfeng's actions, but presumably they sold it as Danfeng getting draconic delirium instead of him being possessed by Shuhu. Baiheng and Jingliu came down to the mountain area, but Baiheng flew ahead of Jingliu. To stop the Shuhu-possessed draconic Danfeng, the Red Moon in RenHeng Imbiheater Luni trailer and Jingliu trailer, Baiheng used an unknown, son of absolute darkness, and blew it up, instantly vaporizing herself to wake up Danfeng from Shuhu's clutch. Alternatively, if you follow the non-chronological reading of RenHeng's Story 3 and assume that the hallucination sequence was a flashback and Baiheng died before the sedition, not during the sedition, then Teng Xiao or Yingxing could be the ones to shoot down the moon and wake Danfeng up as well. I don't personally support this reading, but you guys can check out Lality's video for more details of the non-chronological timeline. Either way, when Baiheng died did not matter much to the sedition chronology. A fire broke out regardless, as witnessed by an egg. But by the time Danfeng woke up, Yingxing had already died from an unknown cause, probably either from the rampaging Shuhu-possessed Danfeng or from the sun of absolute darkness that Baiheng set off. Due to the explosion, Dan Feng broke away from Shuhu's control and found out that Yingxing had died or was close to dying. A figure pulls another figure into their arms despite the danger. At this point, Dan Feng sealed parts of Shuhu and/or parts of the dragon heart inside Yingxing's corpse at around this time for whatever reasons, resurrecting him in the process. There are actually many clues telling us that Yingxing has parts of unidentified dragon bit in him that could influence the draconic transformation process, but I'll explain the specifics of this ritual in another video, or 3 other. It's actually very long, because of course long is long. Of course, as Dan Feng was busy with Yingxing's corpse, the fire still raged on, and the Shuhu-possessed draconic abomination broke loose. Chaos descended to the Scale Gorge mountain area. Sanctus Medicus Mara-struck soldiers, Hoolai, and the Borisons surrounding Luofu broke into the Scale Gorge, killing people left and right, destroying some eggs in the process. Cloud Knights arrived and attacked Dan Feng, the well poisoned by the Preceptors as they blamed him for the draconic abomination. Jingliu arrived too late, already fed with misinformation from the Preceptors framing Dan Feng and Yingxing. She confronted the immortal Yingxing, who fatally wounded her despite being a craftsman by trade and by then had deaged to a black-haired youth. She managed to kill Yingxing. He fell into the mud, but at this point, she already bought into the poisoned well the Preceptors gave her about Dan Feng and Yingxing. She asked Dan Feng on how to kill the dragon, but did not really listen to the rest of his sentence about the blood of my own race and soul of my ancestor, and the Preceptors lied to me. Knowing that she would be shown hallucinations by Shuhu, she tore out a piece of cloth to be her blindfold. However, she did not know that Shuhu could also show people auditory hallucination. As she got close to the Shuhu dragon, her Mara was triggered. She remembered about her experience on Sengqing and, presumably, started hearing Baiheng's voice coming out of the dragon, started seeing Baiheng's visage in her own mind. It was at this moment that Jingliu became convinced that Dan Feng and Yingxing were trying to resurrect Baiheng with Shuhu, and that the attempt went awry, for the draconic abomination must be Baiheng. Of course, with clear context from the rest of the game lore, we know that this is wrong, but Jingliu did not know that at the time. The monster she killed was created with the blood of Vidyadhara and the soul of Dan Feng's ancestor, possessed by Shuhu, not Baiheng. Unfortunately, Jingliu was literally blindfolded at that moment, so she could not see that the eyes of the dragons were mercury and not green like Baiheng. Fully believing that the monster she was fighting was Baiheng, Jingliu gained the shard of Moonlight Sword, struck its head and froze it, worsening her own Mara-struck state in the process. Note here that it is a popular belief that Jingliu did kill the dragon. However, the big dragon tree in the Alchemy Commission with a scar on his head and freeze mark on its I say otherwise. Fun fact, Dan Feng means red maple. You have one guess as to what the big dragon red maple tree is. That, and Jingliu herself also stated in her quest that her target this time was the stars, the same line she told Baiheng while they were drinking together and herself in the Sedition fight. This means that she likely didn't manage to kill the stars the last time. I fully believe that she merely froze it and could not actually kill the dragon. It was at this moment that a gigantic wave appeared, presumably summoned by Dan Feng to seal the dragon. The wave did its jobs, but it also swept away many Cloud Knights, Vidyadhara, and eggs, killing at least 3,000 people as casualties, in a direct parallel to what Dan Feng did in Story 2 on Thalassa. As a result of the sedition, Dan Feng was arrested, his horns broken, his body became a pincushion, and he was jailed by the 10 lords. Jingliu fully went Mara-struck in under a year, believing that Dan Feng and Yingxing had put Baiheng through hell in the worst way possible, and that she had personally killed the person she loved most. It is currently unknown what happened to Teng Xiao, but since Jing Yuan was appointed directly by the Marshal Hua and had gained Lightning Lord from Lan by the time of Jingliu escaped from jail, so in less than 1 year after the sedition, it is pretty safe to say that he also died during or slightly after the sedition. Meanwhile, the preceptor who set him up laughed madly as he got exactly what he had always wanted all along: Dan Feng's downfall, the authority on all of the Vidyadhara, and an arbor branch to create his own Ichor line, A chance at the transmutation arcanum to turn into a real dragon, a real High Elder. With the Alchemy Commission, or more accurately, the Sanctus Medicus, the Preceptor fully believed that he would become the new High Elder. Unfortunately for the Sanctus Medicus and said Preceptor, who is presumably just Taran, Dan Feng was not cooperating. Having learned his lesson, he was not handing over the secrets of the Transmutation Arcanum and the whereabouts of the Dragon Heart. Note that the sedition happened around 700 years ago, long before Dan Shu took over, which had only happened 30 years ago. So the Sanctus Medicus I am talking about here is the Cold Spring sect, not the new sect under the leadership of Dan Shu. But yes, Cold Spring sect is not as innocent and harmless, and they would like people to believe, to say the least. Want to know more about the Preceptor's experiments, Jingliu's own Faustian bargain with the Preceptors after the sedition, the Sanctus Medicus messy history of destroying Xianzhou from within, and Taran's no-good dirty deeds all for the sake of the High Elder job? Please subscribe and stay tuned for the next episode of the Sanctus Medicus series, Taran and the Prisoners of Scale Gorge.